Up next, we have with us our next speaker, Dr. Patsy Perry, right all the way from UK. Patsy? Hi.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you hear me okay?
We are very sorry. We were running little short behind the time.
No problem at all. No
I'll
problem
quickly
at all.
introduce you, then you can start with your keynote. All right.
Thank you.
Dr. Patsy is a reader in fashion marketing, international lead of fashion at Manchester Fashion Institute, Manchester Metropolitan University. With her PhD in management with a focus on corporate social responsibility in garment supply chain is her forte. Her expertise includes the environmental and social impacts of fashion, and her work has been featured in the media and numerous research journals. Dr. Patsy is an associate editor of the Journal of Fashion Marketing and Management and an editorial advisory board member of the International Journal of Physical Distribution and Logistic Management. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Patsy. A very warm welcome to you. Requesting you to kindly start with your keynote.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to try and share my screen now.
Yes.
And it gives me great pleasure to participate in Green Fashion India 2021 and extend my thanks very much to the School of Fashion Technology in Pune for the kind invitation. So although sustainable fashion does start with green design, but also with ethical sourcing, and although we've had a huge focus, and quite rightly so, on the environmental aspects of fashion and textiles manufacturing in recent times due to the climate crisis, I'd like to talk today about social responsibility and the focus on people in supply chains, and also the plight of the workers, and how positive trading relationships between manufacturers and retailers can and responsible purchasing practices can support social responsibility and decent work for people in the supply chain. So as per the introduction, a little bit about me. I did my PhD on corporate social responsibility in fashion supply chains around 15 years ago now. And I did my field work in Sri Lanka, where garment manufacturing is the #1 export industry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my findings from that as I talk. I've also published my work in various academic journals, book chapters, and I've also written for the media and had the opportunity to speak about sustainable fashion supply chains, both on national TV, industry events, and national and international press and media. So looking for production location where the environmental regulations or the labour legislation may be less restrictive than in the home market, so they can get away with things that perhaps would not be possible to do in the home market. And ultimately, we cannot have everything. So good, fast and cheap does not exist, and something has to give. And all of these ethical scandals show us how, when corners are cut, then people and also the environment is exploited. And the exploitation of the environment and the pollution has very real human impacts as well on the people who live in those areas and have to live where water is polluted, where there is land pollution and so on. So although the fashion industry is providing a huge amount of jobs for people, this expansion does come at a price, and we have to question whether those jobs are decent work or what our responsibilities are to provide better quality jobs to people in fashion supply chains. And some of the characteristics of garment manufacturing, again, we've seen this huge pressure for reducing costs. There is extremely fierce competition amongst manufacturers, because retailers are really able to kind of pick and choose each season who they want to work with, and really sometimes pits these suppliers against each other and try to get them to agree to lower prices and faster delivery. the supply chain is really complex, and we see a lot of outsourcing. So retailers and brands are working with a vast network of independent subcontractors, and may not always have direct communication with some of the people that are involved in the supply. All of that is tending to happen in lower labour cost countries, with the associated, cultural issues and difficulties in managing across different cultures and really understanding each other. Because of the labour intensity of production, it is more attractive for retailers to source from developing countries that have much lower labour costs. And this industry is seen as a first step to economic development in many countries, because of the low skills and relatively low investment required to set up a garment factory and train workers to sew. So this is why we tend to see this race to the bottom, where retailers are always looking for the lesser developed country from which they can source for a cheaper price. Another thing that's happened in recent years is really that the power balance in fashion has shifted overwhelmingly towards retailers, which means that manufacturers don't often have the ability to negotiate against contractual terms or the purchasing practices that the retailers try to insist on. So it's very much this. We'll talk about how this came out over lockdown, but the trading relationship, although there is talk about strategic relationships and working together, collaboration, investment into training facilities and planning for the future. In general, the trading relationships between buyers and suppliers tend to be very price focused and therefore very transactional. The retailers are always looking for the best deal on that particular order, rather than thinking about the long term and ensuring profitability across the supply chain as the whole. It's always the focus on the retailer's own margin and kind of lack of consideration of how this might impact on the suppliers. And again, the lack of uniform standards across the world, there is no kind of global legislation against this. And if you are working with a big, powerful retailer, you don't really have the opportunity to negotiate or to question some of the terms of trade that they try to insist on. So there's a lot of pressure around time and speed to deliver things faster, to reduce production times, and to shorten design cycles, and also pay for air freight to get the product into the market quicker. There's also huge demands around flexibility in order to be able to demand quick changes to production, depending on how demand is going in the marketplace at the time. So now some of the biggest, most successful brands, such as Shein in China, Boohoo in the UK, they tend to place very small orders, often in the hundreds, not in the thousands, and really analyse what's happening on the website and then replenish those orders, rather than placing big orders of tens of thousands of garments. So it's more difficult often for the supplier to manage that and to manage capacity in the factory. All of this tends to combine into a perfect storm of a race to the bottom. So a lot of the risk is really placed on the manufacturer, and the relationship is often thought to be at breaking point. And then we come to the social footprint. So the social footprint of fashion is really about working conditions such as wages, the working hours, health and safety, issues around child labour, forced labour, discrimination, freedom of association, and so on. All of these tend to be encapsulated in a retailer's code of conduct, which the manufacturer is expected to comply with as well as delivering on those cost and speed criteria that we spoke of before. But what I found when I was doing my PhD research, I was interested in why sometimes the code of conduct is not able to be adhered to at the factory level, and how do the manufacturers negotiate these often conflicting demands of ethical compliance, as well as pressure to reduce costs and increase speed of delivery. So often the code of conduct is at risk then, and this is why we see some of the social issues and the exploitation, and why, despite mass existence of codes of conduct in most of the world's fashion retailers, we still see some of these exploitation stories cropping up again and again, both in developing countries as well as closer to home, where people are being exploited through poor working conditions, lack of protective equipment, child labour, forced labour, unsafe workplaces, long working hours, and not only in manufacturing, but also now we're seeing this happening in Western economies, in the distribution function, because of the rise of online shopping and the pressure from online retailers, and the need to kind of speed up and pressure workers to fulfil orders, pick orders faster and faster in the distribution centre. So often these warehouse jobs seem to be no better than a Victorian sweatshop, where the labour was there to be sweated out of the workers under immense pressure. And this was seen even all the more so during the COVID lockdown. So we saw this tension between environmental responsibility and social responsibility, where although the environment took a well-needed rest as stores had to shut, factories had to stop producing, and there was a welcome rest for the environment, and there was less pollution in some aspects. But still, the impact on workers was seen to be quite terrible. As stores shut, many of the world's biggest fashion retailers tried to escape from their financial commitments and tried to salvage as much as they could by attempting to cancel the orders that they'd already placed with the manufacturers. So although the fabric had been paid for, the garments had been made, and in many cases they were sitting on a ship even, or sitting in a warehouse ready to be shipped, some of the world's biggest fashion retailers, who are owned by some of the world's richest people, attempted to get out of these contractual obligations and exercise a clause to say this was an unplanned circumstance and they didn't have to pay. Now, once this became, mass public knowledge, thanks to social media and so on, there was a big consumer, citizen, global campaign called the Pay Up campaign, which really forced many of these retailers to kind of rethink their behaviour in that scenario, and many of them did then agree to pay the manufacturers. But the problem, of course, for the manufacturers is that they'd produced everything, paid for everything, but then weren't able to get the payment and then pay their workers, who were then struggling to pay for the rent and their food and so on. So it really brought home the plight of the world's global garment workers, both in Bangladesh, but also those working in the UK for online retailers whose sales went up over lockdown as people stayed at home and still continued shopping online. So some of my findings from my PhD, as I mentioned, I was trying to understand what might be the challenges of ensuring that the ethical code of conduct is implemented at factory level, and what might be the things that kind of challenge the manufacturer to achieve that amidst the pressures for reducing cost and increasing speed of delivery. So I found that on the left-hand side, we have these inhibiting factors, which is the downward price pressure, the nature of the product, which is always changing, So the workers can't always get up to a good learning curve before the next style change comes in. The retailer buying practices, which are quite problematic sometimes for the manufacturer to deal with in terms of like what are the terms of trade and when is payment going to be made. The complexity of the supply chain with the many different companies involved and also the power distribution giving the manufacturers less ability to negotiate terms of trade. But on the right-hand side, there was also a lot of positive factors in that the retail buyers were increasingly concerned about ethical compliance and did want to support the manufacturers to try and help them, do good for their workers. Because of the labour intensity of the manufacture, many of the garment managers that I spoke to said it was absolutely imperative that they provided good working conditions because their business relied on happy workers coming to work every day and sewing. Without the workers, they would have no business. So these were almost the most precious thing in the business. The development of trust between buyers and suppliers in Sri Lanka, it was interesting to see that many trading relationships were 10, 20 years old, that they'd been working with the same retailer for decades in some cases, and that there was more of a focus on committing to working with that supplier, although there was no contract to say so, but it was kind of like an unsaid commitment, and trying to cooperate and collaborate together, looking at more of the long term and using technology to share data to plan production more efficiently and more accurately so as to avoid changes to orders once they'd already been made. And I think the other point about Sri Lanka, there was also a lot of governmental support for Garments Without Guilt, the National Industry Initiative. And also we might say that the level of socio-economic development in Sri Lanka is relatively high. The factory managers were well educated and they understood the need for ethical compliance. And also the national culture of Buddhism and the fact that the philosophy states you do not exploit other people or people beneath you, that kind of set a grounding for ethical compliance to be more easier to implement there. So from that then we can think about what might be the responsible sourcing practices. So it's really important to develop these kind of long-term and stable relationships with suppliers so that they can plan ahead, they can invest in their business, whether that's investing in machinery, technology, training, human resources and so on, and really try to move towards these collaborative, cooperative and mutually beneficial partnerships and trying to share the profitability across the supply chain, not just at the retail end of the supply chain. Using technology to streamline the supply chain and share data for more accurate forecasting and more efficient production. And very important was the issue around pricing and payment. So having a sustainable price so that the manufacturer is able to produce, pay the workers, pay the materials, and not have to subcontract to an unauthorised manufacturer who has worse standards because they can't afford to make it work in their own factory. And also timely payment. So in some cases, manufacturers have to wait up to 3 months after they've shipped the order to get the payment from the retailer, which doesn't really support them to pay wages on time. And then realistic delivery schedules. So enabling manufacturers to make the order in the allocated time without having to have excessive amounts of overtime, locking workers in the factory so that when fire breaks out, they're unable to escape with their lives and so on. All of these things really happen. The root cause of this is the purchasing practices and the pressures on the manufacturers. And also rethinking some of the logic around penalties and making the manufacturer pay for air freight if they miss the delivery deadline, which in many cases is due to the buyer changing the order once it's already gone into production. Most positively, only just last month, September 2021, a consortium representing over 75% of global garment and textile manufacturing, including the STAR network of sustainable Asian manufacturers, the International Apparel Federation, the Better Buying Institute, and a range of other experts came together to establish a sustainable terms of trade initiative to really give a voice to manufacturers around the world and try to create fairer purchasing practices for the benefit of all in the textile and garment industry. So they've published a white paper only just last month, which sets out a number of recommendations, and the fact that they would like to set out minimum standards of behaviour and sourcing practices for everybody who is trying to source from the global garment and textile industry, so that it's not just for some of the the pioneers who do implement better practices, but so that everybody has to have this minimum standard of behaviour, which would be around things such as fairer payment terms, no late payments, pricing should cover all of the costs of ethically compliant production and allow for reasonable and maintained supplier profitability, and that the buyer should cover costs of missing deadlines and then making the supplier make things within a shorter window. So this is a really positive development, but we'll have to see how this goes forward and whether the world's fashion retailers and fashion buyers would be willing to commit to this initiative and agree to these minimum standards of behaviour. And then finally, what's the way forward for this? Really, to be sustainable across environmental and social aspects, the industry cannot continue operating on this cheap labour focus and this prioritisation of price above everything else. But we need to look beyond cheap labour, which might end up costing more, but that needs to be managed somehow. We need to invest in mutually beneficial trading relationships and ensure that manufacturers also gain some benefit from the trading relationship, and really kind of rethink some of the current business logic about expectations of price, quality, flexibility and speed, and whether that's actually possible for the manufacturer to deliver on in all cases. Manufacturers would like a more stable business relationship with buyers, so to have some kind of better way to plan ahead and know that they're going to be dealing with them next season and so on. And really, the Sustainable Terms of Trade initiative is a way of helping us to level the playing field by setting these minimum standards of behaviour for all buyers to comply with, and that way building a fairer marketplace for everyone, and then supporting decent jobs for the world's global textile and garment workers. So I'm going to finish there, and I hope that's given you some food for thought and also given you some insight into how the management of the fashion supply chain kind of plays out into working conditions and our responsibilities for building better supply chain management practices that are then going to help to improve the working conditions and decent work for many of the world's most vulnerable garment workers around the world. Thank you.